Welcome to the Further Light Podcast, presented by Wisconsin Freemasonry, helping you accomplish your Masonic goals through education and more light. And now, I present to you Brother Napoleon Sneed-Janczak. There are many questions regarding Freemasonry, its origins, and the various mysteries that surround how Freemasonry got to where we are today. From the common understanding of operative Masons to regular speculative Masons, we're going to explore this topic by digging back to some of the original manuscripts, practical reasoning, and with a little bit of logical understanding. As we start this journey over the next several minutes, I will attempt to enlighten our 7 listeners with answers to some of those burning questions right from the outset. I'm Brother Napoleon Sneed-Janczak, and today we're talking about the origins of Freemasonry and its degrees. So what is Freemasonry? Commonly, it's a belief of beautiful system of morality, veiled in allegory, and illustrated by symbols. Symbology being one of the key components in our Masonic teachings. These would consist of working tools, structures, and various artworks to aid in our understanding of a just, true, and moral life, and how to achieve those goals. As of right now, no one knows definitively when Freemasonry started. However, we do have documented evidence of when it began having an impact or influence in Europe, and in short order, the world. As stated earlier, Freemasonry is a system of morality, veiled in allegory and illustrated by symbols. This is done through a series of degrees, more specifically the 3 degrees we now know of today: the Entered Apprentice, the Fellowcraft degree, and that of the Sublime degree of Master Mason. The EA degree representing adolescence, the FC degree represents middle age, and the Master Mason representing the graduate or wise master of the work. Now, those of us who are Master Masons, we know that becoming a Master Mason is definitely not the end of our learning, but a beginning step in a lifelong journey in self-discovery and self-improvement. It has been this way since its inception. But how did we get here? In medieval times, craft guilds were formed. These guilds in medieval times were formed to protect the economic interests of craftsmen and merchants by regulating competition within their trade. These were like small communities that promoted learning better skill sets and high standards. Through this process, the guilds were divided and evolved and eventually became what we know of as the 3 degrees that we now know in Masonry today. There were many for all forms of trade works: merchants, treasurers, painters, and others. But since this podcast is about Freemasonry, we will be talking about stonemasons, their guilds, and how that brought us from operative Masons to speculative, free, and accepted Masons. As the skill and labor of stonemasons continued to be called for in high demand, the craft grew, so much so that a member body or guild was formed to regulate the practice, skill, and builders of stonemasonry, as well as protect the sacred trade secrets. Now, I just want to take a moment here and remind you that Freemasonry did not create the guilds, but the guilds have their own origin. And to give context and hopefully a better understanding of what's to come, I'd like to share this excerpt from Encyclopedia Britannica. It tells us, and I quote, "There is no direct evidence for the existence of permanent associations of traders or craftsmen in ancient Mesopotamia or Egypt, and little more evidence exists about such societies in pre-Hellenistic Greece. Such associations are known to have existed in ancient Rome, however, where they were called collegia or collegia. These craft guilds seem to have emerged in the later years of the Roman Republic. They were sanctioned by the central government and were subject to the authority of the magistrates. From the reign of the Emperor Diocletian onward, the imperial government deliberately exploited these guilds in the interest of public authority and social order. The government tried to restrict the membership of the guilds to a hereditary caste of skilled artisans, but the increasing financial demand made upon the guilds by the government in the waning days of the Roman Empire had reached most guilds or had reduced most guilds to a precarious position by the 4th century CE. With the fall of the Western Roman Empire, guilds disappeared from the European society for more than 6 centuries. The collegia did survive in the Byzantine Empire, however, and particularly in the city of Byzantium, Constantinople, now Istanbul, the famous book of the Prefect, a manual of government probably drawn by the Byzantine Emperor Leo VI in the year 900, provides a picture of an elaborate guild organization which primary function was the imposition of rigid controls, especially for financial and tax-raising purposes, on every craft and trade in the city. Although there is no definitive proof, it is largely believed that the Masonic guilds we often refer to derived from the Byzantine roots, and this will make more sense when you look at the formation of the rituals we enjoy in our lodges. The guilds we are dealing with today were found primarily in Scotland, England, and France, but as Freemasonry develops, we see the practice spread. As stonemasonry entered the 18th century, the guilds swelled with craftsmen and began to form local organizations called lodges, and we still see the usage of the term locals and lodges in our modern day trade unions. And yes, like a lot of things in the United States, this too was largely influenced by Freemasonry. I think of the Manufacturers Guild, who actually uses a caliper and a square, similar to the square and compasses in Freemasonry. And I believe that's manufacturers or machinists. Machinist Union, I believe, use that as their logo. While the reason behind the creation of lodges has been widely debated, but one theory includes that due to the inherent danger of their work, lodges were created to take care of sick and injured members, as well as the widows and children left behind from those who lost their lives on the job, similar to our Masonic traditions to care for our members and, by extension, their families. Our sources report that lodges were built following a period of religious war, where many lost their guild buildings or building permissions. They oftentimes would have to meet and make plans in secret so that they would be able to distinguish their work from other competitors at the time. And they created their own ways of recognizing each other by handshakes, other peculiar signs, and even passwords to distinguish themselves by rank, skill level, and even what guild they were a member of. Once commissioned to do the work, they would know who was to be admitted to the workplace. You would also be able to know who or what guild performed the work and created the structures by which there would be left special signatures or markings only known to a select few of those who knew the mark. This is where we continue that tradition in our degrees in the appendant bodies in the United States. And of course in Europe as well, within the first order or Royal Arch. Upon your entry into the York Rite of Freemason, you will see degrees dealing with marks. If you look at some historical buildings today, you'll often see this tradition with the building having a name and year chiseled or cut into the masonry. Most Freemasons should start to recognize the similarities at this point, and the uninitiated community will see this historic tradition in a new light. So definitely go out there and look at some of those old historic buildings and see those stamps, markings on the building. Sometimes on the top, at the peak of the roof, you'll see a name or a year. That was done throughout history. That is a short introduction of operative masonry, condensed to give you a basic understanding of how we developed. So to be clear, stone cutting and building goes back to ancient civilizations, and we can make an educated guess that there was a brotherhood among them, and those skill sets were passed down from generation to generation. I think of Egypt being one example, and I like to use this as an example of, if you look at the pyramids and the way they were built, and I'm not going to go deeply into that, but what you notice with the pyramids is that not every one of those stones is a perfect shape. They're all shaped differently and uniquely, but they form a perfect structure. And that is masonry in a nutshell. We all have our own skill sets and something to bring to the table and make it fit, or at least strive to be more perfect in the way we fit things together. So these men, and yes, some women, were respected and lived by strict code. Other men with various other skills wanted to be a part of the lodges, but were not necessarily stonemasons. Painters, molders, material setters, and so much more. These were men of all kinds with a good moral character, and the fact that men were dying or forced away from their areas of work, they wanted to be still to be able to hold on to the brotherhood. Now let me pause here for a moment to explain something I stated earlier. I mentioned women a minute ago, and when men died working, depending on their status, their women would fill in to help complete the work. I would likely believe this was to fulfill an obligation to complete that work that they were commissioned to do. Those men who were not necessarily stonemasons were then accepted into the lodges, provided they kept the secrets shared in them. Hence, you have free men, free to work, free to go about, depending on their skill sets, and accepted into the lodges, not necessarily having the skill set to cut stones. These men were interested in the close-knit relationships of the guilds and how they were strong in work and charity. This is where we start to get into speculative masonry. So let's make our way into that speculative part. The stages of professional development within the stonemasons guild: apprentices, journeymen, and of course that of the master mason, are reflected in the Masonic process of self-improvement, by which Freemasons go through the degrees and prove themselves worthy of moving up the ranks to their brethren. But where did we transition from secrets of operative stone-cutting masonry to speculative Freemasonry and the rules or rites of passages? I start by letting you know that some of it is esoteric, however most of it is exoteric. That being said, I'd like to give you a basic distinction between what those words actually mean, because oftentimes we obscure what esoteric means and often make it seem mysterious when bringing it up in conversation or other Masonic instruction in the lodges. So what does esoteric actually mean? The definition, according to Webster: esoteric is intended for or likely to be understood by only a small number of people with a specialized knowledge or interest. In other words, it's the things shared within the fraternity that the brothers would understand or be privileged to know by being a member. Exoteric, on the other hand, is simply general knowledge everyone would have access to. You didn't have to be a part of the group to know it. It was just readily available. And now that we got that out of the way, let's move on. There are many documents or manuscripts regarding the origins of Freemasonry and subsequently its rituals and practices. These were known as the Old Charges. The earliest known allusions to Freemasonry's origins can be found in a document known as the Halliwell manuscript or Regis poem, which dates anywhere from 1390 AD to 1425, somewhere in between there. We believe it's at the closer earliest date of 1390. Now, before I get into this more deeply, I want you to understand much of what was written in the early days was only known to a select few, and many of which were high society and arguably masters of the work. I bring this up because many of those tradesmen, as talented as they were, the general population were illiterate, and many of the workings of Freemasons were done verbally, or as we Masons like to say, mouth to ear. In fact, Virginia has no ritual written, or at least at the time or early in the 20th century, there was no written ritual there. They would do everything mouth to ear or by memory. It is all learned by listening and repeating the lectures while looking at the different symbols and illustrations. So like a point and talk, point and speak. You see the picture, this is what it is, this is what it denotes, this is what it means. So the Halliwell manuscript or Regis poem, that particular work does not go into the esoterics of Freemasonry, but deals more with the morals and values. Now, I'm not going to read the whole thing for a couple of reasons. One, it's written in Old Middle English, and that can be a daunting task while trying to explain or decipher the different meanings from the words, phrases, or usages in those times. And two, this would turn into a years-long series of podcasts. Maybe sometime in the future, podcasts will dissect the manuscript itself, but we'll see how that goes in the future. The Regis poem is the earliest of the old charges. It consists of 64 vellum pages of Middle English written in rhyming couplets. In this, it differs from the prose of all later charges. The poem begins by describing how Euclid counterfeited geometry and called it masonry. And this is interesting, for the employment of the children of the nobility in ancient Egypt. It then recounts the spread of the art of geometry in diverse lands. And it's interesting because the Old Middle English, and I'm not going to get too much into this, but it spells diverse as Divers, lands. So you can understand the nuance there. The document relates how the craft or masonry was brought to England during the reign of King Athelstan, and his reign was between 924 and 939. It tells how all the masons of the land came to the king for direction as to their own good governance, and how Athelstan, together with the nobility and landed gentry, forged the 15 articles and 15 points for their rule. This is followed by 15 articles for the master concerning both moral behavior, some of these being: do not harbor thieves, do not take bribes, attend church regularly, etc., etc. Then regarding the operation of work on a building or building site, do not make your masons labor at night, teach apprentices properly, do not take on jobs that you cannot do. That one evolved to mean stay within due bounds, etc. And the grand secret Masonic word of saying no comes to mind. Don't take on too much. Keep your passions in check, etc., etc. There are then 15 points for craftsmen, which follow a similar pattern. Warnings of punishment for those breaking the ordinances or their obligations. You also have a provision for annual assemblies, or what we like to call in today's age, annual communications. Soon, in the poem, there follows the legend of the 4 crowned martyrs, a series of moral aphorisms or truths, and finally a blessing or benediction or closing prayer. You can see the foundation of forming a lodge here. The manuscript was recorded in various personal inventories as it changed hands until it came into possession of the Royal Library, which was donated to the British Museum in 1757 by King George II to form the nucleus of the present British Library. And to give this a visual, that library, if you can think of Harry Potter's wall of books, that's what the British Library would be reminiscent of. It came to the attention of Freemasonry much later, this oversight being mainly due to the librarian David Casley, who described it as a poem of moral duties when he cataloged it in 1734. It was in the 1838-1839 session of the Royal Society that James Halliwell, who was not a Freemason, delivered a paper on the early history of Freemasonry in England that he based on the Regis poem, which was then published in 1840. The manuscript was dated to 1390 and supported by such authorities as Woodford and Hewen. Edward Augustus Bond, the curator of manuscripts at the British Museum, dated it to 1440, roughly 50 years later. However, that was largely sidelined. Hewen also mentions that it was likely written by a priest, and you'll notice that a lot of the religious connotations or religious tool work and symbology kind of lends credence to that idea that religious folks wrote this. In fact, we'll get into that shortly. There are many manuscripts which were used in the formation of the rituals, which ultimately comprise our 3 degrees today. And like most work over time, things change and adjust to fit the needs and understandings for those time periods in which the culture changes or evolves. As we move into the Middle Ages, into the Enlightenment, Freemasonry really begins to take shape and grow. We start to see various concepts begin to take formal shape, structure, and inclusivity. The Age of Enlightenment, or the Enlightenment, also known as the Age of Reason, and for context, this would be roughly between the years 1685 through 1815, of course, was an intellectual and philosophical movement that occurred in Europe, especially Western Europe, in the 17th and 18th centuries, with global influences and effects. The creation of the craft, as it is also called, occurred over time between the first recorded gentleman joining in Edinburgh Stonemasons' Lodge in 1599. Shortly after the Grand Lodge of London and Westminster was formed, the 1721 publication in London of the Constitutions of the Freemasons by Scots Presbyterian minister James Anderson was made available. As you can see, another minister, Presbyterian, etc., had gotten involved with the writing and forming these various manuscripts into an organized fraternity. Anderson was responsible for compiling a large number of manuscripts to essentially bring some order to Masonry. At this point, the old charges had attained a standard form. What later became known as the York Legend had emerged in a form that would survive into William Preston's Illustrations of Freemasonry, a work of 1772 which was still being reprinted in the mid-19th century. The requirements for every new initiate to be sworn to the old charges on the Holy Bible. This now meant that every lodge should have its own manuscript charges. Over 100 manuscripts survived from the 17th century until the period in the 18th, when their use eventually died out. Now, I'd like to touch on something current Masons and non-Masons ask about right here, because it relates to the old manuscripts. It's something we get questions about often, and many Masons find weird, if not something foreign to them. And I'm not going to go off in that direction for a whole long period of time, but it does bear some importance with regard to origination, and that is the idea of the women lodges. There is a theory of what may have been where these came from, and we alluded to this earlier with the stonemasons guilds. But believe it or not, the York Manuscript number 4 actually describes the taking of obligations or charges, as they called them, but references he or she takes the oath in due form. The reason being that if the wife of a stonemason had the skills of her husband after his death, she would be permitted to carry out the work. In this case, the manuscript describes it as having a good hand in writing. And I would also add that even then it was considered to be interpreted in error, but used in some cases to justify those lodges even today. So whenever you see that notion of a irregular women lodge, they tend to use York number 4 as their document to prove their case. This York Manuscript number 4 is also the first place we see documented evidence of an oath specific to the entered apprentice. It describes the apprentice's duties to his master. There is so much to the history as to the origins of Freemasonry that it is necessary to deal with these early stages to give you an idea of how painstaking a process it was to develop something for members only and to give it substance for it to last as long as it has. But what about those degrees? Well, what I can say is that it is rare to see their exact formation because they were often shared verbally and quietly. And to that end, while over 100 manuscript constitutions exist, documents detailing actual ritual are much more rare. The earliest, dating from 1696, is the Scottish Edinburgh Register House manuscript, which gives a catechism and a certain amount of ritual of the entered apprentice and a fellowcraft ceremony. This manuscript was named after the building in which it was discovered, which houses the Scottish National Archives. The Trinity College manuscript, discovered in Dublin, Ireland, which is of Scottish origin, has been dated to 1710 and is substantially the same in content. The recently discovered Airlie manuscript, dated back to 1705, is therefore the second oldest known Scottish stonemasons ritual. Although referred to as rituals, these manuscripts are also what they called aid memoirs or prompt sheets, cue cards, if you will. And yes, they needed prompting just like we do to this day, so that was a thing then. They have 3 factions, but for the ease of reference, they are commonly described as rituals. The significance of these 3 rituals lies in the fact that they are 1, of Scottish origin, 2, are based on the ceremonies used by Scottish operative stonemasons, and 3, that they predate the existence of any Grand Lodge. The Edinburgh Register House is said to be from a lodge of operative Masons. However, this document contains many features of speculative ritual. Hailed as the world's oldest Masonic ritual, the Edinburgh Register House manuscript of 1696 starts with a catechism for proving a person who has the word is really a Mason. Among other things, the person seeking entry is expected to name their lodge, Kilwinning, attributing the origin to the Mother Lodge Kilwinning in Ayrshire. The ritual describes the first lodge akin to the porchway of King Solomon's Temple, and the form of the lodge portrayed in a question and answer session, the form of the answers often being highly allegorical. A fellow craft is further expected to know and explain a Masonic embrace called the 5 Points of Fellowship. The second half of the document describes all or part of an initiation ritual as the form of giving the Masonic word. The degrees of Freemasonry revolve around the building of Solomon's Temple, and in the appendant bodies, those degrees take different side approaches to that, expanding on the concepts and building men better through self-governance, reflection, and renewal. In that way, a kind of building of another more personal but stronger temple with ever-expanding knowledge, further light, if you will. This cornerstone or model essentially molded Freemasonry into what it is today. The systems being put in place with a very formalized structure that had guidelines, or what Freemasons call the ancient landmarks. These landmarks essentially give us direction on what constitutes a lodge and its conduct and the importance of the degrees conferred. Albert Mackey is largely responsible for this by setting 25 landmarks in 1858. In the early 20th century, a gentleman by the name of Roscoe Pound narrowed them down to 7, and in the 1950s, the Council of Grand Masters defined 3 landmarks and basically upheld them. And I would only remind you here that grand jurisdictions have some leeway as to how they interpret them and put them into action or implement them. Albert Mackey was instrumental in the formation of the Grand Lodges here in the United States and the rituals which they now enjoy. Freemasonry is a science with philosophical undertones. Initiatic rites were not always done through allegory or plays. They were often read, and men were tested in their knowledge by giving lectures while using the symbols of the working tools and other ornaments in the lodges. For instance, the master's carpet or even painted aprons. These were often set up lyrically to help in remembering what was taught. Kind of like poetry or rhyming words to help you embrace memory work. It was moved into dramatization with the idea that it would have a greater impact on the initiate. So we wanted you to remain, to retain the information you got. So it started to move into the whole dramatization and allegorical aspect. So what we now know as the third degree or hieramic legend was thought to have more meaning if acted out, and that is why we see that being done to this very day. So, to sum this all up, the oldest written ritual is that of the Royal Order of Scotland, the Edinburgh Register House manuscript of 1696, which begins with a catechism for proving a person who has the word or password is really a Mason, which has been committed to paper since 1741. It comes from a much earlier tradition that claims a 12th century origin. Even that ritual begins with lines similar to, I quote, "As errors have crept into St. John's craft," meaning Freemasonry, "this order and ritual is formulated to correct them and teach the new guys the way to do it properly," end quote. Obviously, there's a great deal more to learn on this topic, but use this as a basic starting point and take some time exploring some of the areas shared in this podcast, such as Anderson's Constitutions, the Regis poem, just about any book by Albert Mackey, and so much more. That being said, thank you for joining me, Brother Napoleon Sneed-Janczak, and the entire Further Light team on your journey to finding more light through Masonry. Are you interested in learning more about Freemasonry in Wisconsin? Visit wisconsinmasons.org to learn more about Masonry and access further educational content and more light. Once again, that address is wimasons.org. Any questions, comments, or suggestions, please email us at education@wisconsinmasons.org. And thank you for listening.